There is a silence older than memory, and it lives beneath the hills of Anatolia. They do not appear on most maps, not anymore. Rolling mounds of ochre and clay, smoothed by centuries of wind and the quiet footsteps of shepherds who no longer remember the names of their ancestors. If you travel far enough into the forgotten arms of eastern Anatolia, beyond where the road dissolves into stone, you might come upon them. Lonely hills that do not speak, and yet somehow listen. They say the earth remembers everything. That memory is not held only in scrolls or stone, but in the hush of soil, in the way it resists the shovel, the way it warms at twilight like skin. And here, beneath these distant hills, lies a secret that has not been spoken aloud in over 8,000 years. A god once slept here, not a god with temples of marble or thunder in his hand, not the kind carved in the likeness of kings, crowned in laurels, born by myths of empire. No, this was a quieter god, one made not of lightning, but of twilight, a god of silence, of stillness, of the sacred space between dreams. His name has been lost, or maybe it was never meant to be spoken aloud, only felt in the chest like the sudden pause before a storm. But traces of him remain, faint like fingerprints on glass left in morning fog. It began with a rumor. A young archaeologist named Layla, raised on stories and sun, was drawn to this place by a shepherd's tale. He spoke of lights in the ground at night, of the hum beneath his feet when he walked a certain ridge, of strange stones that didn't belong to this world. She smiled politely, as scholars are trained to do. But something in his eyes, something ancient and unsaid, made her stay and dig. What she found was not ruins in the conventional sense. No walls, no statues, no glorious frescoes. Instead, she uncovered a pattern of stones, perfectly circular, set deep into the earth, as if placed by invisible hands with impossible precision. No markings, no script, only rhythm. Each night, Layla would sit beside them and whisper. She didn't know why. A habit formed in childhood, speaking to the wind, to the trees, to the stars. Perhaps she hoped the ground might answer. And one night it did, not with words, but with a dream. She saw a figure standing in the dust, faceless, cloaked in dusk. It did not speak. It only held out its hand, palm up, as if offering sleep itself. Around its feet, the wind moved in spirals, not chaotic but tender, as if remembering a dance once sacred. She woke before dawn, breath shallow, heart full. The next day, she returned to the stones, and this time, she noticed what she had missed, a hairline crack in the center of the circle, so fine it was invisible under the sun, but glowing faintly in the blue light of morning. She placed her hand upon it. Warm. The earth was warm. No one could explain it. There were no heat vents, no magma chambers nearby. The geologists offered theories, but theories, Layla thought, were only the bones of wonder. She wanted the soul, so she listened, and over weeks, months, seasons, she began to feel it. A rhythm, a pulse, as if the earth itself was breathing beneath her. And with each breath, a story drifted up, not in language, but in sensation. A people once lived here. They did not write. They did not build high walls or wage wars. They sang, they dreamt, and they loved their gods not as distant beings in the sky, but as neighbors, shadows, reflections in the water. And this god, the one now lost, was the god of nightfall, of thresholds, of the moment the bird pauses before it flies. He did not demand sacrifice, only reverence, only quiet, only sleep. But sleep, as all things, can be forgotten. And so he faded, not with rage, but with sorrow, as a candle sighs before it dies. Now, only the dust remembers, And the hills still listen. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine those ancient mounds under Anatolia's stars. Imagine a time when the divine did not wear gold, but moved gently through dreams. And know this, not all gods were meant to be worshipped in temples. Some were meant to be remembered in sleep. They called it the cradle of gods, not because the divine was born there, but because it never truly left. Anatolia is a land of thresholds. It is not quite east, not fully west. It is where continents clasp hands like old friends who remember each other in dreams. Where the sun rises like an amber coin over the copper mountains of the east and vanishes behind olive hills to the west, leaving behind shadows that seem too ancient to belong to this world. This is not a land that shouts. It hums. And it is this hum, this soft, sacred vibration, that guided the first wanderers who crossed its rivers, climbed its jagged ridges, and whispered prayers into the wind long before stone was shaped or names were written. If you listen, truly listen, you'll hear it. A harmony older than language. A resonance between land and soul. The ancients knew it, or perhaps they simply felt it in their bones. They chose their sacred sites not for defense or glory, but for alignment. Places where wind met water, where shadow met sun, where the veil was thin. Layla, still tracing the quiet mystery of the circular stone site, began to study the geography that surrounded it. Not the geography found in modern maps, but the old geography, the spiritual cartography etched in forgotten paths, in the way starlight touched the ridges, in the scent of time growing wild along the slopes. She noticed how the site sat nestled between two hills, like a secret cradle by the earth. The morning sun touched it exactly at the equinox, and in the evening, the shadow of a nearby mountain would fall across it like a curtain. Light and dark, day and night. A temple, not of walls, but of timing. Perhaps that's what the people of this lost cult worshipped most. Not a god with form, but a god made of balance. The space between breath and silence, between waking and dreaming, between what is remembered and what chooses to be forgotten. This land does not divide the world. It binds it. It is where the sacred and the profane once held each other's gaze without shame. Where a single stone set on a hilltop could become a universe. Where absence could feel divine. Layla wandered further, tracing invisible lines of energy, the kind ancient dowsers once followed with forked branches and closed eyes. She began finding patterns in the placement of seemingly random stones. A curved alignment, a mirror of constellations, a path that followed not the river, but the moon. She came upon an old tree. Its bark was dark and cracked like old leather. Its branches curled inward, cradling emptiness. At its base, she found offerings. Recent ones, a handful of coins, a strip of fabric tied to a root, a small stone carved with a spiral. She asked the villagers. They shrugged. "It's just something we do," one woman said. "For luck." But luck is often another name for reverence. A survival of the sacred long after the theology has faded. And so Layla sat beneath the tree, her notebook forgotten in her lap, and watched the light filter through the branches. She noticed how the shadows danced like soft hands on the ground. She thought of the people who once lived here, who walked these hills barefoot, who sang to gods with no faces and placed flowers in the cracks of rocks. She began to understand. This was not a civilization lost to time. It was a devotion lost to language. They did not build towering ziggurats or vast pantheons. They did not etch their beliefs into stone for future men to decipher. They gave themselves to the land, to the wind, to the pause between footsteps. And in that space, in that in-between, they found something holy. Maybe That's why the gods left. Or maybe they never did. Maybe they are still here, folded into the warm breath of the hills, asleep in the shadows of apricot trees, whispering through cracked earth and the rustling of dry grass. And maybe if we listen, not with ears, but with the soft places inside us, we will hear them again. Not as thunder, but as a sigh, a lullaby carried by the land between sun and shadow. Some secrets do not shout. They wait beneath the surface, soft, patient, and pulsing with memory. Layla had not come looking for gods. Not really. She came with maps and gloves, notebooks and carbon brushes. A scholar, a listener of stones. She believed in the quiet language of layers, the way the earth folded time into itself like a letter never sent. But even she could not have anticipated the whisper she felt in her chest the morning she found the sigil. It began as a shimmer, barely visible through the veil of dust clinging to the limestone. Just another slab at first glance, flattened, unassuming, but something about it pulled at her like an unfinished sentence on the tip of the tongue. She crouched beside it as the wind slid over the ridge, bringing the scent of dry herbs and distant rain. Her brush moved gently, as one might touch the face of a sleeping loved one. Grain by grain, the soil fell away, and there it was, a spiral. No, more than that, a double spiral, coiling inward upon itself, then blooming back out like a wave captured in stone. It wasn't decorative. It was purposeful, alive. Layla froze. Not Hittite, not Phrygian, not even Neolithic in the familiar Göbekli Tepe sense. This wasn't part of any pantheon she knew. No bull heads, no solar discs, no serpents eating their tails. Just this spiral, carved deep into the earth as if the stone itself had been taught to breathe. She reached for her field journal, fingers trembling slightly. She had seen spirals before, of course, across cultures, across millennia, but this one felt different. It had weight, not physical, mythical. Some ancient traditions say the spiral is the shape of birth, of life folding in and unfolding again. The passage from one realm into another, womb to world, sleep to waking, known to unknown. Others claim it is the map the soul follows in dreams. Layla found herself tracing it unconsciously with her fingertip, and for a moment, just a flicker, she felt not alone. Not watched exactly, but witnessed, as though something long dormant had opened one eye and remembered her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The stars above Anatolia shimmered like cold embers, and the wind coiled through the tent flaps like a murmured name. She dreamed of stone corridors curved like ribs, of footsteps behind her that left no sound, and of a voice, low, melodic, genderless, speaking in a tongue she didn't recognize but somehow understood. When she woke, her notebook lay open on her chest. A spiral had been drawn across the page. She didn't remember doing it. The days that followed brought more discoveries. Not ruins, but alignments, subtle deviations in the soil, hints of geometry in the way wildflowers bloomed or where moss refused to grow. She began to see the landscape not as random, but arranged, as if it had once been composed for something sacred. A map, not of places, but of moments. And always the spiral returned, carved faintly into loose stones, etched into the underside of ceramic shard, burned lightly into a piece of bone too old for any known era. Each one was slightly different, yet unmistakably of the same hand, the same vision, a symbol of movement, yes, but also of containment, of memory turning back upon itself, of gods who were never meant to be captured in statues or scripture, but in rhythm. Layla consulted scholars across continents. Many shrugged, a few speculated. But one old professor, long retired and half blind, simply said, "Ah, the earthen ones." She leaned forward. He nodded slowly, as if remembering something from a childhood fever dream. They didn't speak to men, only to time. Their worship was silence. Their presence, pattern. They were never meant to be found. She left with more questions than answers. But that night, as she stood at the edge of the excavation site, the last light brushing the ridgeline in gold, she understood something she could not write down. The spiral was not a message. It was an invitation to walk, to enter, to follow the curve back to where memory fades into myth, and myth dissolves into silence. Somewhere in the soil, a god once dreamed, and now perhaps it dreams again. There are temples the wind remembers, even when the stones have forgotten their names. Long before cities rose, before kings carved their stories in tablets, and empires claimed the gods as their own, there were sanctuaries made not by hands, but by longing. Places carved by silence, shaped by shadow, dreamed into being by those who did not need altars to believe. Layla had wandered too far that afternoon, drawn not by logic, but by an inexplicable pull, something deeper than curiosity, as if the land itself was humming beneath her feet, nudging her forward. She followed an invisible line across the hilltops, past the spiral stones, past the tree wrapped in ribbons and ash, until she reached a ridge where the sky seemed to touch the earth in secret. There, she saw them, barely visible at first, only the tops of ancient stones peeking through the wild grass like sleeping giants. Weathered by wind, softened by time, their surfaces cracked and pitted like the skin of elders. But their placement, it was no accident. A ring, a perfect ring, half buried, half sinking into the memory of the land. No inscriptions, no gods in human form, no thrones, no thunderbolts, just stone, heavy, silent, dreaming. Layla stepped into the circle, the air shifting subtly around her, as though entering another climate. The wind fell still. Her breath seemed louder. The shadows pulled differently. Something had changed. She knelt beside the tallest stone, her fingertips brushing over its ridged surface. Unlike the sigil from before, this stone bore no mark, no spiral, and yet it pulsed with presence. Not an image, but an impression, as if the stone itself had once contained a dream and was now remembering it. Archaeologists often speak of ritual spaces, those polite words used when nothing quite makes sense. But this felt like something deeper. This was not a place for ritual. It was a place for reverence, for stillness, for surrender, perhaps even for sleep. She lay down in the center of the ring, her back to the cool earth, eyes open to the pale Anatolian sky. And in that moment, she imagined what once was. Not a crowd of worshippers in elaborate robes, but a single figure, barefoot, quiet, carrying a bowl of water or ash. A gesture, a hum, a pause so deep it became holy. She imagined stone as witness, not monument. Some ancient cultures believed stone could dream. That memory wasn't a human invention, but an elemental one. That rocks remembered not with words, but with warmth, with vibration, with the angle of light upon their surface. They believed that certain stones, when placed in the right pattern, could open a space between worlds. Not a gate, but a mirror. Layla recalled a myth she once read in a fragment of Lycian poetry. The gods sleep within the bones of the world and wake only when the stars align in silence. What if this was such a place? A cradle for sleeping gods, or a room where humanity once lay beside the divine, not to beg, not to plead, but simply to rest, to listen, because not all prayers are words. Some are presence, Some are silence wrapped in breath. She rose slowly, brushing the dust from her back. The sky had deepened into a bruised lavender. Birds had gone quiet. The ring of stones glowed faintly in the twilight, not with light, but with memory. She placed her palm flat on the central stone and whispered, not in her own language, not in any language at all, but in sound. Low, steady. A hum carried from her chest to the stone. It felt right, like returning, like touching a part of herself she didn't know had been missing. That night, she recorded in her journal. They didn't build temples to house the gods. They built temples to remember that the gods were never separate from the land. These stones are not ruins. They are dreamers, and they are still dreaming. Not all gods demand fire and blood. Some arrive with the hush of nightfall and leave only dreams behind. It began with a whisper, not heard but felt. Layla had begun sleeping among the stones. Not every night, but often enough that her dreams no longer felt like her own. At first, it was for practicality, to guard the site, to observe the changes in light. But gradually it became something else. A pull, a calling, as if the land itself wanted to speak and could only do so when the world fell quiet. She started waking at the same hour, just before the first trace of light touched the horizon. A time the ancient Anatolians once called the breath of the gods. That fragile moment when night still clings to the edges of the world and the veil between realms is thinnest. And in that silence, she began to hear them. Not voices, not exactly, but sensations folded into sound. A murmur in the soil, a rhythm in the wind, a breath at the nape of the neck when no one is near. It was in this state, between sleep and waking, that she first understood. These were the gods of sleep, not in the modern sense of slumber or science, but of sacred repose, of surrender. These gods did not walk among men with swords or chariots. They moved through dreams, visited the dying in their last exhale, cradled the fearful in times of darkness. They brought no answers, only softness. No miracles, only forgetting. Some cultures named them. The Luwians, perhaps, whispered of Aluma, the twilight being who laid hands of quiet upon the minds of kings. In a later Carian fragment, a figure called Anipa, she who opens the veil, appears briefly, always accompanied by stars and silence. But these are echoes, faint footnotes of something more ancient. The truth is, the sleep gods of Anatolia were never fully described, because to describe them would be to limit them, and they were not meant to be known. They were meant to be felt. Their temples were not built of walls, but of rhythm, stone circles designed to slow the heartbeat, to hush the mind. Spaces calibrated to moonlight and breath. It is said that initiates would lie within the rings for 3 nights, eating nothing, speaking nothing, only dreaming. And what they dreamed changed them. Some returned with a quiet glow in their eyes. Others never spoke again. A few were said to walk into the hills and vanish, smiling. Layla found remnants, hollowed out niches in stone where herbs had once been burned. Not incense, but sleep-inducing plants. Wild poppy, blue lotus, asphodel. She found feathers bound with hair, buried in the soil like talismans. And more spirals, etched lightly into stone like a fingerprint that dissolves at first rain. She began documenting her dreams, and they grew stranger. One night, she dreamed of a dark pool surrounded by reeds. The surface of the water was glass, and when she leaned over it, she saw not her reflection, but that of a tall, faceless figure with stars where eyes should be. It reached out, not to threaten, but to offer. A moment later, she awoke with a single word on her lips. One she did not know, Zeriel. She searched every language she could find. Akkadian, Lycian, Urartian, nothing. A name, perhaps. Or not. Perhaps just the sound of a memory resurfacing. She asked herself, what if the gods of sleep never left? What if they simply receded, not out of weakness, but mercy? What if they grew tired of being forgotten and so folded themselves into the folds of our dreams, where they could still touch us gently without being named? After all, who among us hasn't felt it? That moment just before sleep claims you, when the body feels not heavy, but sacred. When a single breath carries the weight of centuries, and a dream feels more true than the world you'll wake into. Perhaps those moments are not yours. Perhaps they're gifts, whispers, offerings from the gods who died forgotten, or from those who never died at all. Tonight, as your breath softens and the world fades behind your eyelids, imagine them. Those ancient, faceless deities wandering the dreamscape, placing a gentle hand over your heart. Not to possess, not to disturb, but to remind you there is something holy in surrender, something divine in silence, and something eternal in sleep. Some gods are born not from sky nor sea, but from the ache between warmth and forgetting. Layla had begun to notice something strange about the air. It wasn't the scent, though there was always a hint of time, of dust, and after dusk, a kind of sweet, smoky fragrance she could never place. No, it was the texture, the way the air moved, as if carrying a weightless memory, a breeze that wasn't quite wind, a warmth that didn't come from the sun. She first felt it just before sunrise. She had spent the night among the stones again, resting her head on folded cloth, the spiral etched in the central slab just inches from her brow. Sleep had not come easily that night. Her dreams had been fragmented, colors melting, faces with no eyes, and distant drums that seemed to echo from within her own chest. She had awoken breathless, shivering though the air was still. And then she saw it. Mist. A low-hanging, silver mist rolling in across the valley. Not from the river, not from any source she could name, but flowing in like silk across stone and grass. And within it, briefly, just long enough for her breath to catch, she saw movement. Figures. Not solid. Not shadows. Something in between. As if the mist itself had formed limbs, and those limbs danced slowly along the ridge, arms stretched skyward, heads tilted toward the breaking light. By the time the sun rose, they were gone, but the scent of smoke remained. Later that morning, while tracing an old path worn into the hillside, she met an old woman gathering herbs. Her scarf was faded, and her eyes were that kind of cloudy blue that seems to see more than it should. They spoke for a while, Layla asking, the woman answering in fragments, in gestures and sighs. When Layla described the mist and the shapes within it, the old woman did not blink. She simply said, "They're the children of fog and flame." She said it as if speaking of weather or time. Layla pressed gently, asking what she meant. The woman hesitated, then knelt to the ground and began drawing in the dust with her finger. First a swirl, then a triangle, then lines between them. Then she whispered a story. She spoke of a time before the gods had names, when the sky was still young and the earth still dreaming. And in that dream, two forces met, not as opposites, but as lovers. One was fog, soft, unformed, carrying memory in its breath and sorrow in its silence. The other was flame, wild, bright, not destructive, but illuminating, not angry, but alive. Together, they birthed children, not men, not beasts, something else. Beings who could take shape only in the hour between light and dark, who walked not in this world, nor in the next, but in the seam where both stitched together. The villagers once left offerings for them, ribbons hung on trees that faced the mist, small fires lit in hollowed stones. bowls of milk left on thresholds, not to appease, but to invite. Because these beings did not punish. They reminded. They came to those who forgot how to feel, how to dream, how to let go. They were neither gods nor spirits, the woman said, but echoes. Echoes of the divine before it fractured into pantheons and myths. Embers of something whole. As she finished, she looked up at Layla and smiled with a sadness that felt centuries old. If you see them, she whispered, don't speak. Only breathe. That's all they ask. That night, Layla lit a small fire at the edge of the stone circle. She did not speak. She only breathed. And as the flames danced and the night air thickened with silver fog once more, she felt them return, not as intruders, but as memory taking form. One brushed past her, not touching, but seen in the flicker of firelight. A shape not quite male, not quite female, moving with a grace that was neither human nor animal. Eyes like burning coal, hair like steam, a presence that made her heart ache without knowing why. And she understood. These were not gods of war or weather. They were gods of becoming, of transition, of the moment mist meets flame and neither surrenders. She sat until dawn, unmoving, the fire burning low, the fog dissolving into the quiet breath of morning. When she stood, her limbs felt lighter, her mind quieter, her questions still unanswered, but somehow less urgent. She would later write, there are beings who do not live in myth, but in the spaces myths avoid, not born of sky or sea, but of longing and light. And in the fog they still dance, reminding us that not all divinity needs form, only flame, only mist, and the willingness to watch without needing to understand. There are languages that leave no trace, no carvings, no parchment, no ink. Only the memory of sound in the bones of the earth. Layla had spent weeks among the stones, documenting their alignments, tracing spirals with trembling fingers, dreaming under twilight skies. And yet, one question continued to rise in her mind like smoke with no fire. How do they speak? The people who built these temples, who danced in fog and offered fire to silence. How do they call upon their gods, if not with names? If not with prayers chiseled into stone? Because nowhere among all the ruins had she found a single symbol resembling a known script. No syllables, no pictographs, no incised chants, only shapes, spirals, circles, converging lines that hinted at meaning but dissolved under the lens of interpretation. She shared her findings with linguists. Most dismissed it. Preliterate culture, they said. Ritual markings, not language. But Layla wasn't so sure. There was something about the way those patterns repeated, not like art, but like rhythm. Like something spoken without speaking. Then, one night, she stumbled upon a recording. It was a scratchy archival audio from the 1930s, captured by a German ethnographer in a small village near the Tigris River. The label was vague. Untranslated ceremonial chant. Female elder. No transcription available. Layla pressed play, and the sound that filled her tent was not a song. Not in the way we know songs. It was a breath. A rise and fall of tone, like wind swelling through a reed. The voice did not speak words, it vibrated. Rising, dipping, sustaining certain tones for heartbeats too long to feel comfortable. It was dissonant at first, then strangely soothing, then haunting. The voice repeated a specific sequence, low and trembling. Layla found herself closing her eyes, her body instinctively swaying, not to rhythm, but to resonance, as if the sound was tuning something deep inside her. She played again, and again, and again. Each time, it felt less foreign, until it felt like home. The next morning, She brought her speaker to the stones and played the chant into the wind. Nothing happened, but the silence afterward felt different. Charged, expectant. The birds did not sing. The grass seemed still. And then, just briefly, a low groan from beneath the earth. Not mechanical, organic, as if the stones had sighed. That night, she sat beside the fire and began to hum. Not from memory, but from instinct. She let the vibration shape her throat, the pitch rise and fall in ways that bypass thought. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't melodic, but it felt true, and something shifted. The fire swayed against the wind as if pulled sideways. The air grew heavy, not threatening, but thick, like the pause before thunder. She saw them again, not the mist beings of the ridge, something older, figures that stood just at the edge of her vision, tall, still, draped in what looked like ash and vine. No eyes, no mouths, but their presence radiated recognition. Not of her, but of the sound. She stopped humming, and the world returned to silence. In her journal, she wrote, "This is a language made not of letters, but of vibration. It is not meant to be read. It is meant to be felt. It moves like breath across stone, like wind over water. It lives in the throat, in the chest, in the marrow. And it is not learned. It is remembered." She began to notice this principle everywhere. In the way certain stones resonated differently when tapped. In the way birds fell silent at specific hours. In the way her own heartbeat seemed to sync with the wind at dusk. The old tongue had no alphabet because it was never meant to be fixed. It was a living frequency, a music without music, a language spoken not to gods as distant beings, but with gods as co-dreamers of the world. Perhaps that is why no record of it remains. Because the moment you try to write it down, it ceases to be alive, like trying to bottle smoke, like trying to measure silence. And yet, its presence lingers in the instinct to hum when we're alone, in the lullabies whispered to children whose minds still live half in the dream, in the chants of nomads, monks, midwives, and madmen. It was never gone, only hidden beneath the noise of history. Layla would go on to describe the old tongue not as a lost language, but as a sacred condition, a tuning of the self to something vaster, something quieter, a remembering of the body as an instrument of prayer. And tonight, if you feel brave, hum something you do not understand. Let it rise from your breath. Let it shape itself in your mouth. Do not name it. Feel it, because somewhere beneath the ancient hills of Anatolia, the stones still listen, and perhaps they are waiting for your voice to remember them. Some rituals are not meant to summon, but to remember, and some moons are not meant to shine, but to bleed. There are nights when the sky turns ancient, nights when the moon swells, rust-colored and low, casting no warmth, only memory. Layla had seen blood moons before, through telescopes and camera lenses, their science explained in lectures and textbooks. But here, on the hills of forgotten Anatolia, it felt different. It felt alive. For 3 nights, the villagers had whispered of its arrival. No fanfare, no celebration, only hushed warnings to bring animals indoors, to avoid mirrors, to keep water vessels covered. Layla asked why, but the answers came in fragmented sayings. The old ones walk when the moon forgets its light. Don't speak to shadows on blood nights. Milk sours faster, so do thoughts. She had learned by now not to dismiss such warnings. And so, on the night the moon turned the color of burnt copper, she climbed alone to the high ridge above the spiral stones, drawn there not by reason, but by intuition. She wore a shawl against the sudden chill and carried nothing but her notebook and a single white candle, unlit. The air was heavy, still, no insects, no birds, no wind, And then, as she reached the crest of the hill, she saw them. 6 small circles of stone, arranged like petals around a larger central one. The same size, the same weathered texture as the ones she had studied before. But these were untouched, hidden beneath brush and lichen, undisturbed. And in the very center, nestled in the largest stone ring, lay an old copper bowl, green with oxidation, half buried in earth, but still intact. Beside it, a flat stone slab, blackened by time and perhaps fire. The scene did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Layla approached slowly, the moon now directly above, painting everything in a dim, crimson sheen. She lit her candle and set it in the center of the bowl. Its flame flickered against the blood-red sky, like a whisper fighting to survive. Then she noticed them, small offerings tucked into the crevices of the outer stones. Some recent, others ancient. Poppy seeds, dried feathers tied with red thread. Moon-shaped pieces of bread hardened into fossil. And in one corner, a string of teeth. Human, tiny. She felt no fear, only reverence. Kneeling, she placed her hand upon the blackened slab. It was cold, colder than the night around her, smoother than it should have been. She closed her eyes and let the silence speak. And in that silence, a vision came. Not a hallucination, not quite a dream, something in between. She saw a circle of figures, cloaked not in robes, but in veils of smoke and fabric dyed with the juice of crushed berries and ash. Their faces painted not for beauty, but to blur identity, to become less human, more vessel. They stood in stillness surrounding the bowl. Then one by one they approached it. Each offered something: hair, blood, a fragment of bone, or a whispered memory carried in breath. They bowed not to a statue, but to the sky, to the bleeding moon. This was no plea for favor. This was not a petition. This was remembrance, a renewal of the bond between human and God, between flesh and shadow, through witnessing. Because these gods, Layla realized, did not require obedience. They required presence, to be seen, to be felt, to be named without names. The rite was not about sacrifice. It was about anchoring, the act of holding a space so that something older, softer, might rise through the cracks in the human mind and remind us of what we once knew. When Layla opened her eyes, the candle had gone out, and though the moon still bled above her, she felt clean, like something had passed through her and left behind a kind of stillness. She did not take the bowl. She did not disturb the offerings. She only sat, breathing with the stones, until the first thread of light appeared on the edge of the sky, and the crimson began to fade. In her journal, she wrote, "There was a time when we worshipped not with sound, but with stillness, not with altars, but with witnessing. The blood moon, right, was not an act of devotion, but a remembering of the space between the stars and the skin. A moment where even the gods paused, to be held in our gaze. And perhaps that is the greatest offering of all, to see and to be seen, without fear, without need, only presence. So tonight, if the moon turns red and your breath catches without reason, know this: you are not alone. You are being remembered. And somewhere, in the dust-covered circles of an Anatolian hill, a god with no name remembers you too." Some places vanish from maps, not because they are lost, but because they remember too much. It started with a hill that hummed. Layla first heard of it from a toothless boy who sold figs on the roadside. He spoke with the certainty of one who had never left his valley, but who understood, perhaps more than scholars, that mystery is not a question to solve, but a presence to feel. "You want to see the hill that sings?" he asked, grinning. She didn't answer. She only followed. The path was narrow, tangled with thistle and sleep-heavy wildflowers. Birds flitted through the branches, their wings quiet, as if reluctant to disturb the air. The climb was slow, and the boy didn't speak again. He only pointed, eventually, to a rise in the distance. A round hill, too perfect to be natural, too still to be forgotten. Layla reached it by dusk. From a distance, it looked like a mound of earth and grass, common, unremarkable. But the closer she came, the more the illusion unraveled. Half-buried stones jutted like broken teeth from the soil. Shards of pottery peered through the grass like old eyes. The scent of time and something faintly metallic lingered in the breeze. But it was the sound that stopped her. A vibration, not loud, not musical, but constant. A low, humming resonance that seemed to live just below the threshold of hearing. You felt it more than heard it. In your bones, in your teeth, behind your eyes. She stood at the center of the hilltop, letting the sound sink into her. And she understood. This place was not empty. It was waiting. She camped at the base of the mound that night. The wind moved strangely, coming in brief spirals, like breath exhaled in ritual. Her dreams were fragmented. Flashes of tall, narrow houses built from clay and bone. Laughter in a language she could almost remember, a well with no bottom. The next morning, she explored the hill's base. What she found was astonishing, but also haunting. Steps. Stone steps, just barely visible beneath centuries of sediment and moss. They led not up but down, into the earth. She did not descend. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the village nearby, the one from which the boy had guided her. It clung to the hills like moss to stone, its paths crooked, its houses leaning as if tired from remembering. She asked the elders its name. They shrugged. "We used to have one," said an old man with cracked hands. But it stopped being said. Layla pressed further. He told her of a time, maybe 5 generations ago, when they stopped speaking the name aloud. Not from fear, not from awe, but from a kind of forgetting that felt natural. As if the name itself had begun to fade, syllable by syllable, each time it was spoken, until one day it simply dissolved. "We call it the place," he said, "or nothing at all. We know where we are." Some said it was cursed. Others said it was blessed. A few said the hill had once been a temple, one not of stone, but of silence. A place where the old gods were buried standing up, their bodies turned toward the east, so they could watch the sky even in death. Layla returned to the mound, and this time she descended. The steps were narrow, worn smooth by centuries of feet long turned to dust. The air grew cooler as she moved downward, until she could see nothing but the faint light of her lamp and the stone swallowing her whole. And then, the chamber. A single room, circular, low-ceilinged, with walls covered in pressed clay. But it wasn't empty. At the center stood a column. Just one. Short, wide, covered in thousands of delicate marks. Not script. Not carving. Breath marks. That's what she called them. Indentations that looked as if someone had pressed their lips softly, repeatedly, against the clay as it dried. The whole column was covered in them, like kisses from a world that had no need for letters. Each mark distinct, each one human. Around it lay small objects, stone beads, loops of faded red thread, a broken piece of a child's toy carved from antler. These were not offerings to gods as we imagine them. These were offerings to memory itself, to the act of remembering without needing to know why. Layla sat in that chamber for hours, not writing, not measuring, just listening. The hum was louder there. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the earth shifting. It was the sound of presence, of a place holding its breath, not out of fear but reverence. She returned to the surface at dusk. The sky had turned violet. The birds had returned, but something within her had changed. Not learned, changed. She wrote in her journal, "This village has no name because names are gates. and some places must remain sealed. The gods here do not rise when spoken. They rise when remembered without words. And in their silence, the hill hums, not to call attention, but to call us home. That night, in her tent, she dreamed again of a girl running through streets of clay, laughing without reason, of a god who watched from beneath the soil, not to judge, but to witness, of a village that was not forgotten, only hidden beneath the dust of what no longer needs to be named. And if you ever find yourself walking alone in Anatolia, far from the roads, and feel the ground vibrating beneath your feet, pause, close your eyes, and listen, for you may be standing at the edge of the village that forgot its name, and it may be remembering you. Before the gods wore crowns or wielded thunder, before their names echoed in temples or scriptures, there was something else, something wild, something wordless. Layla had begun questioning the very framework of divinity, not because she no longer believed, but because belief, as she had come to understand, was too small a word for what she was beginning to feel. The discoveries, the dreams, the chants in the wind, none of it aligned with the pantheon she'd studied. No rows of masculine figures carved into rock. No thunderous kings seated on mountain thrones. No tales of conquest and divine judgment. Only spirals. Only mist. Only presence. And so a thought began to bloom in her, slow and tender like spring breaking through frost. What if the first god was never a man? What if the oldest divinity was not shaped in human likeness at all? Not father nor mother, not warrior nor lover, but something other. She began to explore the oldest myths from the region, not the polished versions passed down through civilizations, but the fragmented whispers, the ones etched in oral tradition, in lullabies sung to goats at dusk, in the strange stories shared around firelight that elders claim not to remember in the morning. In one, she found mention of a presence called Nuba, a being made of water vapor and bird shadow. Not described, only referred to. Nuba came before the mouth could speak, the line said, and taught the rain where to fall. In another, the deity was not a being at all but a rhythm, the pulse in the belly of a pregnant woman, the tide that rises without moon, the chill that comes just before dawn. She read again and again accounts of early figures, female, male, neither, both, who experienced visitations. But what they saw was not a god with eyes or limbs. It was a deer made of flame, a cloud in the shape of breath, a song sung from underground. These weren't metaphors. They were memories of a time when the divine was not like us, when the sacred could be a gust of wind or the stillness between bird calls. Layla returned to the site of the blood moon rite, drawn not by logic, but by a slow, magnetic yearning. She sat in the circle of stones and waited. This time, not for answers, but for the presence. And it came, not as a vision, not as a dream, but as a noticing. The way the grass bent without wind. The way her breath slowed on its own. The way the earth beneath her felt less like soil and more like skin. She closed her eyes, and in the black behind her lids, something moved. Not a figure, but a sensation. Something vast. Not benevolent, not cruel. Simply aware. She did not feel seen. She felt held, as if her very atoms had been gathered in the palm of something nameless, and that presence whispered, not with words, but with temperature, with gravity, with time. She remained there until stars pinpricked the sky and her legs numbed beneath her. When she rose, she felt lighter, not healed, not transformed, simply remembered. That night, she wrote in her journal. The first god had no face. It had no gender, no voice, no story. It lived in the curve of the land, in the pause between footsteps, in the heat that remains in stone after sunset. We gave it names because we were afraid of silence. We gave it bodies because we feared the formless. But before we sculpted it, before we prayed to it, we were it. She came to believe that this ancient Anatolian cult, the one so elusive, so unspeakable, was not devoted to a being, but to a principle, a force, a presence, one that could not be drawn, or named, or even invoked, only welcomed. Perhaps that's why they left no statues, why they built circles, not temples, why they sang in tones, not tongues. Because the divine was never something outside them. It was the mist in their lungs, the fire in their bones, the spiral in their dreams. And so, tonight, if you close your eyes and ask to be guided, do not wait for a voice or vision. Wait for the warmth behind your heart, the weightlessness in your limbs, the gentle feeling of being returned to. For the first God was not a man. The first God was breath, was shadow, was rhythm, and it may still be with you, in the silence between your thoughts, in the space behind your name, in the part of you that does not need to be understood, only felt. There are those who do not die. They simply lie down in the earth and wait for the world to remember them. They called her Isru, though no record confirms it. The name lives only in whispers, carried in the wind between stones, sung by old women in lullabies no longer understood. It means nothing in modern tongues, but some scholars believe it once meant she who waits. Layla first heard of her in the northern village of Yalvac, where an old woman, nearly blind, traced her finger across a scar in the stone floor of her home and said, "There is a woman beneath the hill. She has not breathed in 1,000 years. But she is not dead." Layla asked if she meant a legend. The woman only smiled. "She will wake when we forget how to speak." The villagers called it the Sleeping Mound. It lay several kilometers from the main road, an isolated rise overgrown with silver grass and poppies, so smooth it could almost be mistaken for a natural hill, if not for the way the earth dipped at its crown, as if it were breathing. No one lived nearby. No shepherds grazed animals there, not because it was cursed, but because it was sacred. Layla made her way there at dusk. The wind was warm, the kind that carries the scent of old herbs and distant ash. There were no paths, only instinct. She reached the top just as the stars began to scatter across the sky. And in the hollow at the center of the mound, she found it. A stone circle, broken in parts, sunken into the earth. Its pieces arranged like vertebrae, tracing a spine buried deep in the land. At the center, a slab, rough, ancient, darkened with time, and on it a body, whole, untouched. A woman, her skin gray as cooled lava, her hair the color of river clay, her hands folded over her heart. She wore no crown, no robe, only a garment woven of bark thread and linen, frayed by centuries but still intact. There were no signs of embalming, no resin, no wrapping, only the body, and silence. Her lips were slightly parted, as if caught in the breath before a word. Her eyes closed, not by death but by intention. Layla knelt beside her and wept, though she could not say why. It was not sadness. It was recognition. She knew, without evidence, without logic, that this woman had not been placed here in death. She had come willingly, to sleep, and more than that, to wait. All around the slab, small objects had been left. Bundles of dried lavender, fragments of obsidian, rings of braided horsehair, feathers sealed in beeswax. None of them new, none of them recent. Offerings layered by generations of silence. But there was no temple, no shrine, because this was the temple. This body, this breathless woman, this waiting. Layla could not bring herself to speak. She simply placed her hand on the earth beside the slab and closed her eyes. And something moved. Not the body, the air. It changed texture, like silk pulled across the skin. The smell of dust grew sweeter, like honey warming on stone. And in the darkness behind her eyes, Layla saw a dream. A circle of women dressed not in grandeur, but in simplicity. Their heads shaved, their faces painted with ash. They stood in silence around Isru, each one offering a memory, a sound, a touch. Then one by one, they disappeared into the mist, leaving her alone. The last priestess, the last bridge, she lay down willingly, not as a martyr, not as a queen, but as a seed buried not to die, but to become. And the land accepted her, not with ceremony, but with stillness. When Layla opened her eyes, the stars had shifted. Hours had passed. She didn't know if she had slept, or dreamed, or witnessed something through time. But the woman, this priestess, remained unchanged. And yet Layla felt changed. She wrote in her journal, hands trembling. Some souls are not meant to burn and rise. Some are meant to lie in silence and teach the earth how to breathe. She is not a relic. She is not an artifact. She is the last prayer spoken without sound. Layla left nothing on the slab. Only her breath. Only her silence. And when she descended the hill, the wind shifted again, carrying her heartbeat with it. That night, the villagers claimed they heard singing. Not in the air, not with their ears, but beneath their feet. A soft hum, a lullaby, the sound of something not waking, but remembering. So if, one day, you find yourself standing on a lonely hill and feel a warmth beneath the earth that does not match the season, do not be afraid. She is still there, still waiting, still dreaming us back in her arms. Some sanctuaries have no walls, no altars, no gates, only the endless breath of wind and the bitter kiss of salt. Layla followed the stories to the coast. The map was old, the pages worn and brittle like autumn leaves. It bore no names, only symbols, spirals, and the faint trace of a coastline drawn not in ink, but in memory. She was told the temple no longer existed, that the sea had claimed it, that the wind had turned its stones to dust and its gods to whispers. But there was something in her chest, a pull like a current below the heart. And so she went. She walked where cliffs broke the land into jagged song, where olive trees leaned from the salt air as if whispering to each other across centuries. The further she went, the fewer the voices, the older the silence, until at last she found it. Not the temple, but its breath. A stretch of white stone, eroded to smoothness by the sea, curling into a cove where no boats anchored and no birds dared nest. The wind there moved differently, not in gusts, but in waves, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like the exhale of something asleep. She stood there a long time listening. There were no ruins, no columns, no signs of human work. But the shape of the land told a story. A natural amphitheater, a curvature in the cliff like a rib cage, shallow indentations that could have been steps or simply worn paths made by centuries of barefoot pilgrims who came not to worship, but to feel. She removed her shoes and stepped onto the stone. It was warm, almost unnaturally so. The wind wrapped around her shoulders like linen soaked in memory. The scent of salt and something older, something like rain that has forgotten its sky. And then she heard it. Not a voice, not music, but a tone, low, sustained, vibrating in the stone beneath her feet. A resonance not unlike the one from the hill that hummed, but different, sharper, saline. If the hum of the inland temple was the sound of soil remembering breath, this was the sound of water remembering form. She sat at the center of the natural bowl and closed her eyes. The wind became a liturgy. The salt became scripture, and Layla became stillness. In that moment, a memory came, not hers, not dreamt, but passed through her. A vision of people standing along the shore, facing the sea, their hands painted white with chalk and ash, their eyes closed, their mouths open, not speaking, but allowing the wind to pass through them, as if they themselves were flutes carved by the gods. There were no prayers, only presence, and in the distance, rising from the sea, a figure, not solid, not shaped, a glimmer, a distortion in the air, a being made of horizon. It did not approach. It did not demand. It only watched, listened, and the people stood in return, not to worship, not to plead, but to mirror, to reflect back the silence that had given them life. When Layla opened her eyes, tears had already fallen. The salt stung her skin, but she did not wipe it away. She understood now. This was the temple of wind and salt, not built by human hands, not marked on any map, but alive in geography, rooted in rhythm, and like the gods it once held, utterly formless. She spent the night on the stone, wrapped in her coat, listening to the wind sing through the cliffs. No dreams came, only a great, endless peace. In the morning, as the tide whispered its secrets into the rock, she found something nestled between two stones. A piece of glass, sea-smooth, carved in a spiral. Not ancient, not modern, timeless. A sign, perhaps, or just the sea giving back what it had borrowed. She wrote in her journal, "Some temples are not ruins. They are rituals disguised as landscapes. This place was never meant to be found. It was meant to be felt. The moment wind brushes the soul, and salt baptizes the breath. The divine here does not speak. It surrounds, and to enter is not to arrive, but to dissolve. So if you ever find yourself by a shore that hums, where no birds sing, and the wind pauses as if waiting for you, close your eyes, bare your feet, breathe. You may have entered the temple already, and if you listen with your skin, you just might hear the ocean remembering your name." Some gods do not show their faces. They do not ask for fire, nor demand sacrifice. They only wait, to be offered the smallest things. A gesture, a breath, a forgetting. Layla had begun to notice them. At first, she thought they were accidents. Strips of red cloth tied around the base of an old fig tree. A smooth stone balanced on the edge of a well, turned white by sun and time. A ring of poppy petals arranged in a perfect circle at the entrance of a shepherd's hut. But they were too deliberate, too quiet to be meaningless, too beautiful to be coincidence. She asked the villagers. Most simply shrugged. "It's just something we do," they said, with the casual reverence that only those raised inside a mystery can possess. Our mothers did it. Their mothers, too. One woman, older than any Layla had met before, spoke softly while peeling beans by candlelight. "They watch us, but do not ask. So we give what we can." "Who watches?" Layla asked. The woman smiled without looking up. "The ones behind the air." Layla pressed no further. Some truths grow more distant when chased. That night, Layla wandered through the outskirts of the village, following not a path, but a feeling. The moon was a dull bronze, and the trees moved with the elegance of slow dancers. She carried nothing but a handful of wild thyme, a habit she had picked up from the locals. She came to a clearing she had never seen before. An almond tree stood alone in its center. Its bark split and hollowed, its limbs twisted like questions, and at its roots, a strange scene awaited her. Dozens of objects carefully placed, a comb missing 2 teeth, a doll's eye carved from polished bone, a torn page from a prayer book folded 3 times, a fishhook wrapped in silk, dried lavender bound with human hair, a chicken feather dipped in soot. Each object told no clear story. And yet, together, they sang a quiet, wordless song. A litany not of language, but of intention. Layla approached with care. She did not step too close. She knew, instinctively, that these were not offerings to God she'd read about in dusty volumes. These were for the invisible ones, the ones who watch from the edges of vision, the ones who live behind doors that never fully closed, the ones who received not gifts of gold, but memory, ritual, trace. She knelt just beyond the edge of the tree's shadow and placed the time upon a flat stone, arranging it in a spiral. No prayer, no chant, only silence. The wind stirred, sudden and warm, wrapping around her shoulders like a mother's shawl. The air thickened, not with moisture, but with weight, like breath held across centuries. And then, something impossible. The tree sighed. She heard it, low, cracked, like an old woman exhaling after holding in a story for far too long. Layla did not move. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened. In a hush, she felt them, not figures, not shapes, not visions, but presences. A rustle where there was no leaf, a warmth at her back, the feeling of being looked at by someone who doesn't want you to be afraid. It lasted only seconds, but she knew, without proof, without doubt, that her offering had been accepted. Not because she was worthy, not because she was chosen, but because she had remembered to offer. Later, in her tent, she wrote, "The invisible do not ask for blood. They do not punish nor bless. They exist beyond our notions of fairness or fate. They simply are, and what they seek is attention without demand, reverence without theology, the gift of being remembered by those who still know how to leave something behind, without asking for anything in return." And perhaps that is what offering truly is. Not transaction, not exchange, but the humbling act of saying, "I see you, even though you do not speak, even though you do not show. Still I see. So tonight, before you sleep, place something small beneath your pillow, a leaf, a thread, a tear, and offer it, not with intention, but with surrender. The invisible are still here, watching, listening, waiting for the gentle sound of you remembering how to give." Some gods did not bring rain or fertility. They did not protect harvests or bless newborns. They came quietly, through fevered skin and cracked lips, and sat beside the dying, until the silence took hold. There are fragments, broken tablets, pieces of clay not even dignified with catalog numbers, tucked away in museum basements across Anatolia. On some of them, a name appears, always damaged, always incomplete. Nash, Nuzta, Neeshtar. The rest is lost. No image, no temple plan, no hymn, but always, alongside the fractured name, symbols, a flame turned downward, a hand with no fingers, and a circle filled with black ink. Layla first encountered the reference in a footnote, a small citation buried in an early 20th century ethnographic field report, written by a German nurse who had lived for decades in the eastern Anatolian plateau. The women of the mountain villages, she wrote, still leave milk in cracked bowls during outbreak seasons. They say it is for the one who watches the weak, not to protect them, not to save them, but to witness their suffering. Layla followed the trail into the highlands, where the air thins and the light bruises everything it touches. She arrived at a village half abandoned, half asleep, where the roofs leaned inward like heads bowed in prayer. There, she met an old healer, a woman with one eye and hands stained with smoke. She lived beside a ruin that no one named. When Layla asked about the offerings of milk, the woman nodded, as if she'd been waiting to be asked her whole life. "He does not cure," she said. "He waits. He counts the breaths of the dying." She led Layla to a cave hidden in the cliffside behind her hut. Inside, the walls were dark with soot, and the air held the tang of old sweat and dried herbs. And on the far wall, barely visible, A shape had been painted in a reddish-black pigment that smelled of iron and ash. A figure, tall, formless, no eyes, no mouth, only a thin vertical line down the center of the head, like a closed wound. And in the chest, an empty circle. Not a heart, a space. Layla stood in silence. And as she stared, she understood. This was not a god of death. This was a god of the moment before death. The god who sat at the edge of the bed, not to heal, but to witness. To make the final moments sacred. To hold the pain when no one else would. Layla asked what the people had once called him. The old woman smiled. We do not say his name anymore. It stays in the throat too long. If spoken, it never quite leaves. She told her the story of a fever that once swept through the mountains. A time when children burned from within, when men wept in doorways, and the fields turned brittle with neglect. No gods came, no answers, only this figure, seen at night standing by wells, seen in dreams, pressing cool palms to burning skin, seen in the corner of the eye as breath grew shallow. And yet, they left him gifts, not of gold or incense, but of reflection, shards of broken mirrors, locks of hair from the dead, tears saved in small glass vials, the final words of a loved one, scratched on his stone with bone, because they believed he did not take. He received. He absorbed the weight of grief when a heart could no longer carry it. They didn't pray to him for healing. They prayed for dignity, for the quiet holding of pain. And when the fever left, the people didn't celebrate. They cleaned his shrine with salt and silence, then sealed the cave with stone, not from fear, but from respect. That night, Layla sat outside the entrance alone. She did not light a fire. She did not write. She only sat, and in the long dark, she felt it. Not a presence, a heaviness, like standing in a room where someone has just cried. And in that wait, she felt love. Not the soft love of lullabies or embraces, but the kind of love that stays with you in agony. The love that doesn't try to fix you, but chooses to stay anyway. When she returned her notes, she wrote, "Some gods did not wear crowns. They wore silence. They did not punish or reward. They bore witness to the parts of us too heavy for others. They sat beside the dying and made grief holy. So if, one night, you feel a stillness settle around you in the midst of your pain, if you feel seen, not judged, not saved, only held, then perhaps he is still with us. The forgotten plague god, not the god of disease, but the god who walks us through it, one breath at a time. There are stories buried in the ground, but some begin in the sky. It began not with a myth, but with an alignment. Layla had been reviewing aerial drone images of the site. A quiet afternoon, windless and warm. She wasn't looking for anything specific, only tracing the known stones again, measuring, mapping, hoping the sky might reveal what the earth had hidden. And then she saw it. A pattern, not in the arrangement of the stones alone, but in their shadows. At a certain hour, just before the sun began to fall, the standing stones cast lines across the dust that mimicked a constellation. It was unmistakable, Orion, not precisely as we see it today. The belt was looser, the angle broader, but the echo was there, like a memory retold through the hands of time. She thought at first it was coincidence, pareidolia, the human mind seeking pattern. But the next evening, she returned to the site with chalk and string, mapping each shadow. The lines matched, and more than that, the center stone aligned perfectly with the belt stars on the winter solstice. She felt it in her chest. Not revelation, recognition. Something ancient and buried had just looked back at her. She contacted astronomers, historians. They nodded politely, skeptically. Alignment doesn't prove divinity, they said. Civilizations have long revered the stars. Yes, But Layla wasn't speaking of reverence. She was speaking of presence. What if the stars had not only been worshipped, but remembered? Not as distant lights in the sky, but as beings who had once walked the earth. She began searching through old Anatolian folk tales, not in libraries, but in kitchens, in whispered stories told by grandmothers during needlework, in lullabies sung to restless children. And she found them, mentions of those who gleamed, who came not in fire, but in silence, of the ones with no breath, who taught how to read the sky by listening to water, of a being named Ashtala, whose skin reflected the dark, and whose voice was only ever heard in dreams. One tale, told by a shepherd whose mind had begun to fade, described a time when the stars came down and danced upon the hills. He did not speak in metaphor. He spoke with tears in his eyes, as if mourning a home no longer visible. Layla returned to the site with a sky map drawn for the year 9500 BCE, before the pyramids, before writing, before kings. She compared it to the stone placement. The fit wasn't perfect, but it was close. She began to see the entire site not as a ritual ground, but as a map, a mirror, the earth mimicking the sky, not for worship, but for invitation. What if, she wondered, these early Anatolians didn't believe in gods descending from the heavens, but remembered when they last walked here? Not aliens, not myths, but beings of light, of resonance, of alignment. And the stones? They weren't altars. They were anchors, fixed points to recall a time when the veil between heaven and earth was so thin it breathed. In one corner of the site, Layla found a stone she hadn't seen before. It was buried deeper than the others, almost entirely swallowed by time. She spent hours uncovering it. On its surface, a series of dots and lines, carved with careful rhythm. She didn't recognize the script, but when she transcribed it and laid it against her sky map, something emerged. The lines matched the paths of stars across the night sky. Not fixed points, but movement. This wasn't a map of the stars. It was a recording of how they moved through the years, how they returned. And beside the diagram, one final mark, a spiral. Always the spiral, not as a signature, but as a door. That night, Layla slept in the center of the site, under the open sky. No tent, no fire. She watched the stars until her eyes closed. And in her dream, she saw a figure made of night. Not shadow, not darkness, but night itself. Skin like deep water, eyes like frozen flame. It did not speak. It stood beside her, and for a moment, she understood everything. The stars, the stones, the songs, all of it. When she woke, her face was wet with tears, and she whispered the only words she could find. They never left. They became the sky. She wrote later in her journal, "The stars we see are not above us. They are beside us, within us, moving through us like old blood, like forgotten dreams." The ancients did not seek the heavens. They remembered them, and they built stone to hold what memory could no longer carry. So if tonight you lie beneath the stars and feel one flicker a moment too long, do not wish, do not speak, only feel. You may not be watching the sky. You may be remembering the time when the stars walked the earth. No one remembers the last prayer. No one recalls who whispered it, or if it was whispered at all. But somewhere in the dark, a God still waits, in the silence that came after. Layla had begun to feel it in the stones. Not a presence, not a voice, but the absence of something that had once been alive. The rituals had faded. The offerings dried to dust. The names erased not by war, nor conquest, nor even time, but by something gentler. Neglect. The soft forgetting that comes when life demands too much of the living. She sat one afternoon by the spiral stone, the one that first drew her here. The wind was still, the light brittle, the landscape around her vast and indifferent. No ceremony that day, no findings, no symbols, just the vastness of absence. And for the first time, she wondered, what happens to a god when no one is listening? She had assumed the divine disappeared, that it faded like ink and rain, dissolved back into the sky, or broke apart like bone underweight. But as she sat, she felt something different. Not death, waiting, a presence not extinguished but paused, like a breath held too long, like a note at the edge of music, trembling with the desire to resolve. She imagined it, a god, faceless and vast, sitting beside a cold altar, watching as the last flame flickered out. Not angry, not bitter, just still, because divinity, she realized, does not need belief to exist. It only needs space. And when that space is no longer held by song or fire or prayer, it does not collapse. It becomes silence, not absence, witness. She thought of the temple of wind and salt, the cave of the priestess, the hill that hummed. None of them had been destroyed. They had simply been abandoned, not from cruelty, but from distraction. The world moved on, and the gods remained buried beneath calendars and concrete, beneath the busy noise of the modern mind. And yet, the silence remained loyal, because silence is the oldest form of prayer, the one that predates language, the one that listens without asking, the one that stays after everyone else has left. She began to study the empty places, the hollows where statues once stood, the cracks in the stone where pigment once clung, the faint scent of myrrh still embedded in the dust, rising only when warmed by sunlight. And she realized these were not remnants. They were sentences left unfinished. An ancient conversation paused mid-thought. She imagined returning to those forgotten gods, not to resurrect them, not to claim them, but to simply sit with them, to give them what had been taken. Witness. She began to leave offerings, not of objects, but of stillness. 10 minutes at dawn, a breath held beside a well, an hour of sitting without thought beside the stone. Each time, she felt it, not a response, not a miracle, but a soft unfolding within herself, as if something long withered was blooming again in the soil of her ribs. She wrote, "Worship was never about asking. It was about remembering that something greater still listens, even when we forget how to speak, that even in silence, there is a listener." One morning, just before first light, she dreamt of a god. Not a face, not a body, only a flicker in the space beside her. She turned toward it and asked nothing, and it wept, not from sorrow, but from the relief of being seen again. When she woke, the sky was pearl gray, and a single crow perched on the spiral stone, watching her as if it had been waiting all night. So if you ever stand in a place that feels too quiet, where the wind does not move and the air sits heavy, know this: you are not alone. You are in the company of something ancient, something that once held your ancestors' dreams, and still waits not to be praised, but to be felt. There is a silence older than speech, and it is still listening. Some names are not chosen. They are remembered, and in speaking them aloud, we open a door that was never meant to open again. The story came to Layla like so much Isatris, not in an academic journal, but in the back of a kitchen, over cracked tea glasses and the scent of boiling rosewater. A man in his 60s, stooped and sun-darkened, leaned in and said without ceremony, "There was a boy in my village once. We gave him the wrong name." Layla asked what he meant. He shook his head. "Not wrong. Too old. Older than us. Older than the language." He told her the story in pieces, as if afraid the full version might still echo. The child was born during a strange spring. The sky had stayed clouded for weeks, and the bees had vanished. The midwife claimed the baby didn't cry, only opened his eyes, wide and silent, as if already aware of something no one else could see. They named him Naira. It wasn't a name from their family, or their village, or their language. It came to his mother in a dream, spoken by a figure made of smoke and roots. Name him Ira, it said, and he will belong. So she did. For a while, nothing happened. The boy grew like any other, quiet, watchful. He spent hours alone by the edge of the forest, humming to himself in rhythms no one recognized. But then the strange things began. Animals acted differently around him. Goats would freeze, eyes wide, when he passed. Birds would gather in trees near his house, but not sing. He began sleepwalking, always toward the same place, an old well sealed generations ago after it ran dry and filled with fog. And he spoke of dreams, of the ones with the long backs, who whispered in his sleep, of a voice that called to him from below the earth, of a room with no doors, where light came from inside the stones. His mother told the elders. They came, watched, prayed, and one of them, the oldest, paled at the mention of the name. Naira is not a child's name, she whispered. It is the name of one who was not meant to return. Layla listened in silence, her tea forgotten. She asked what the name meant. No one knew, or perhaps no one dared say. Some said it meant, he who listens beneath. Others claimed it was a title once spoken only during eclipses in the buried temples. One whispered that the name belonged to a god that had been buried alive, not in punishment, but in reverence, sealed beneath the hills so his dreams would fertilize the land. Speaking the name was like tapping the lid of a tomb with a silver spoon. After the boy turned 7, things worsened. He stopped eating meat, refused to walk in sunlight, spoke less, but when he did, his voice sounded older, calmer, measured, like someone recalling a memory rather than discovering it. Then one night he vanished. No footprints, no struggle, only the scent of myrrh in his empty bed, and his name scratched into the wall in a spiral. Naira. The villagers searched, cried, buried an empty coffin, but no one spoke the name again. They began calling the boy the one who listened, and the sealed well, untouched for decades, began to hum. Layla visited that village. It was nearly empty now. A few stone homes, a leaning minaret, the forest creeping closer every year. She found the well, still sealed, covered in moss, the air around it heavier than the rest of the hill. And when she stood beside it, she felt it. A presence. Not hostile, not kind, just listening. She didn't speak the name. She only sat for a while, letting the stillness stretch, letting the silence do the remembering. And in that moment, she understood. The name wasn't meant to summon. It was meant to wake. Because names are not labels. They are keys. They unlock memory. They unearth divinity. They return what was once laid to rest, not in anger, but in love. Layla wrote in her journal that night, some names are not invented. They are carried across lifetimes, waiting for the right mouth to shape them again. When that happens, the earth shifts, the stones breathe, and the gods, still dreaming, open one eye. So if you ever dream a name you've never heard, and wake with it resting on your tongue like honey and ash, do not speak it aloud. Not yet. Close your eyes. Place your hand on your heart and ask yourself, is it a name or is it a memory waiting to rise again? Some say the gods live above. Some say below. But there are places in the earth where breath still lingers. Warm, slow, ancient, as if the planet itself were remembering how to exhale. The path was almost invisible. Layla had heard about it from Shepherd's son with eyes too quiet for his age. He said nothing directly, only drew a shape in the dust with his finger, a spiral that folded into a mouth, then pointed to the mountains. She followed his gesture across days. The trail wound through cypress groves and silent passes, climbing toward the pale peaks of the Taurus Mountains. With each step, the world grew quieter, as if the wind itself were holding its breath. The trees thinned, the air sharpened, the sun softened, and then, without warning, the ground dipped. Not sharply, gently, like the sigh of a sleeping giant beneath the skin of the world. There, in the hollow between two limestone cliffs, she found it. A narrow opening, almost too small to notice, framed by roots that curled like fingers and moss as soft as breath. Cold air spilled from it, not a draft, not a breeze. It pulsed, in and out, in perfect rhythm. Layla stepped closer, and the earth inhaled, not metaphorically, literally. The wind pulled into the cave with a slow, deep force, as if something vast and invisible were breathing in through the rock. Then a pause. Then came the exhale, warm, humid, scented with stone, water, and something older. Layla touched the entrance. It was damp, alive. She entered without hesitation. Inside, the air changed. Not just colder, but denser. Full. Alive with something she couldn't name. She could hear the breathing more clearly now. A low sound, too rhythmic to be wind, too deep to be an animal. It vibrated in her chest, like a drum hidden inside her ribs. The cave curved downward, and she followed it by feel, her fingers brushing the walls, the stones slick and veined, like skin over arteries. The light dimmed, then disappeared, but still she continued. She had no torch, only trust, and the sound of the earth's breath to guide her. After what felt like hours, the path widened, and the breath grew louder. She had entered a chamber, vast, open, soundless, except for the steady inhale, exhale that now echoed through her body like memory. And in the center of that darkness, light, faint, blue, not from the sun, not from fire, but from the walls themselves. Faint bioluminescence pulsed from streaks in the stone, creating the illusion of a heartbeat. Slow, gentle, steady. She knelt, not to pray, to listen, because the breathing wasn't just from the cave. It was through her. Her chest began to sink with it. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. And in that perfect rhythm, a vision came, not through eyes, but through skin. She saw people gathered in the cave, long before temples, before villages. They stood naked but unashamed, their bodies painted with spirals of ochre and ash. They did not speak. They did not chant. They only breathed together, in unison, in this living chamber beneath the earth. And from the walls, something responded. Not a voice, a presence. The mountain was not dead. It was listening, and it loved them, not with affection, but with recognition. They were not visitors. They were cells of its body, extensions of its breath. Layla remained in the chamber until her knees trembled and her heart beat in perfect harmony with the walls. When she finally rose, she placed her hand against the stone. It was warm, and it breathed beneath her palm. She whispered no prayer, only her name. And for a moment, she felt as though the mountain whispered it back. When she emerged, the world had changed. The sky looked closer. The trees felt younger. Her body lighter. She wrote in her journal, "We speak of the divine as something above. But here, beneath the skin of the world, I have touched the breath of something far older. Not a god of fire or wisdom, but a god of continuity. A god whose name is rhythm. A god whose temple is the pause between breaths. So tonight, as you lie in the dark and feel your chest rise and fall, do not rush. Breathe. Inhale as the cave does. Exhale as the mountain remembers. For somewhere beneath your feet, the earth is alive and is still breathing with you." Some rituals are not meant to summon the gods, but to remember the god within. And to return, we must first dissolve. The scroll was barely legible. Not ink, but pigment. Faded gold brushed on a lambskin, buried in a sealed clay jar deep beneath the floor of a collapsed village shrine. Layla discovered it on her 27th day in the field. The writing was in no known alphabet. Symbols drifted across the page like dreams half remembered. Spirals within spirals, feather marks, droplets, and something that resembled breath written in shape. It was not a prayer. It was a guide. A ritual performed once every 7 years during the darkest night of the moon. It was called the Returning. No further context, no author, no date, only a sequence of actions. Smear the eyelids with honey collected from hives that have never seen sun. Cover the soles of the feet in ash gathered from a sacred fire no longer burning. Lie upon stone beneath the sky, naked but for one thread, red and tied at the wrist. Breathe, but do not speak, for speaking seals the soul inside the body again. Layla read the passage again and again, not with academic curiosity, but with an ache she didn't know how to name. The instructions felt familiar, not in form, but in resonance. She asked the elders in a nearby village if they had heard of such a rite. One woman, after a long pause, nodded once. "We do not do it anymore," she said, voice brittle with time. "But I remember my grandmother, the smell of ash on her feet, and the bees, always the bees." Layla waited for more, but the woman only closed her eyes as if to say, "What must be known is not told, it is felt." So Layla decided not to study the ritual. She would perform it. She found the hive high in a cleft of the cliffside, deep in shadow, its honeycombs pale as bone. She climbed at dusk, her hands shaking, the bees strangely silent. She mixed the honey with herbs she could not name, only feel. She found the remnants of an ancient hearth, a circle of stone, blackened by centuries, now abandoned. She gathered the cold ash in a linen pouch. She walked barefoot to the high plateau where no sound but wind existed. There, beneath stars that felt older than time, she stripped down to her skin, tied a single red thread around her wrist, and anointed herself in silence. Honey on her closed eyes, ash upon her feet, stone against her back, and she lay down to remember. She thought of nothing. She resisted the urge to speak, to name, to pray. And in that silence, she began to feel it. First, a warmth, not external, but inside the bones. A quiet fire kindled not by friction or desire, but by recognition. Then the sounds, not of the world around her, but of the world within. Her own blood like river water, her breath echoing across the caverns of her ribs. Her heartbeat, steady and slow, as if sinking with something beneath the ground. And then the presence, not above, not below, within, not a god. Herself, seen as if for the first time. Not the self of mirrors and language, but the self that existed before story, before identity, before form. She did not rise. She dissolved. The edges of her body became indistinct. Her skin lost definition. She could no longer tell where she ended and the stone began. She was ash. She was honey. She was earth and memory and light and death and birth, all folded into one single, pulsing stillness. She became the ritual, not the performer, not the subject, but the space it required to exist. And in that space, something opened. A spiral, a breath, a return. When she finally opened her eyes, the stars had shifted. Her skin was sticky, her feet gray with ash. The red thread had vanished, carried off by wind, or perhaps by completion. She did not cry. She smiled softly as if for the first time. She wrote in her journal, "To return is not to go back. It is to shed, to unname, to become once more what we were before we became ourselves. The God does not meet us at the end. The God is what is left, when we stop trying to be anything at all. And perhaps that is the truest ritual. Not the fire, not the words, not the offering, but the choice to let go. So tonight, when the world feels too heavy and your name too sharp in your mouth, close your eyes. Imagine honey on your lashes, ash on your feet, stone beneath your spine, and return to breath, to stillness, to the self that remembers the God within. There are moments that don't pass, nights that do not end, and time, ancient as it is, sometimes waits, not for the stars, but for us. It was not foretold. No prophecy spoke of it. No oracle dreamed it. No calendar warned of its coming. And yet it happened. Somewhere in the highlands of Anatolia, beneath a sky inked black with the weight of millennia, the stars stopped. Not visibly, not with drama, but subtly. Layla was the first to notice. Not because she was watching the heavens with instruments or charts, but because she felt it in the base of her spine, in the silence between breaths, in a way her shadow didn't shift as the hours passed. At first, she thought it was fatigue, or illusion, or that the night was simply longer than usual. But the birds did not sing at dawn, because dawn never came. The stars remained fixed. Orion hung forever above the ridge. The moon, swollen and soft, did not budge from its perch. The world, still breathing, had become unmoving. And yet, there was no panic, no earthquakes, no plagues, no fire, only stillness. And in that stillness, something deep began to rise, like silt stirred in a river's sleep. Layla climbed to the ancient mound at the edge of the excavation site. She sat where generations of priestesses once knelt, their knees now dust, their whispers embedded in stone. She stared at the sky that no longer moved, and she listened. At first, nothing, but then, a low sound, not in the ears, but in the chest. Not a hum, not music, a question, unspoken, untranslatable, yet utterly clear. Have you forgotten what you are? It was not accusatory. It was not divine judgment. It was longing, a question asked by a sky that had once been part of us, that had once walked beside us, that had once burned within our bones like wild light. And now it waited, not for repentance, not for worship, for remembering, because time, the oldest god of all, is not a tyrant. It is a lover, and lovers, when neglected too long, do not rage. They pause, and so the stars paused, not as punishment, but as offering. Across Anatolia that night, fires burned in silence. No songs were sung, no prayers recited, only people sitting beneath the sky, waiting for something they couldn't name. And slowly, they began to remember. A woman in a ruined village smeared clay across her face and traced circles in the dirt. A boy dipped his hands into the river and whispered his own name over and over until it felt sacred again. A man laid down in the fields and let the breath of the earth rise through his skin. There were no instructions, only instinct, only stillness. Layla stood and stretched her arms toward the sky, not to plead, not to summon, but to join, to offer her body, her breath, her presence, as one more thread in the great forgotten weave of sacred time. And then, after what felt like forever, the wind shifted, gently, a single breeze, then another. The moon wavered, the stars blinked, and the sky moved, not abruptly, not triumphantly, softly, like an ancient being waking from a nap it hoped would never end. And the birds sang, as if they'd never stopped. Layla sat down, the soil cold and kind beneath her. She did not weep. She exhaled. In her journal, she wrote, "The gods do not punish us for forgetting. They wait. They pause the sun hold the moon, still the sky, not because they need our praise, but because they ache for our return. And when we remember, not with words, but with breath, they begin again. So tonight, if the stars feel too still, if the night lingers longer than it should, do not be afraid. It may not be the end. It may be the moment the universe is waiting for you to remember. There's a God who never answers, not because it is silent, but because it is full of every wish. You cannot bear to speak aloud. It has no name, or perhaps it has all of them, whispered, buried, swallowed. Not written in stone or sung in chant, but breathed into the night like warm air on cold glass, where it lingers and disappears. Layla first heard of it in the pause between stories. She had been interviewing a man who claimed to remember the sound of the priestess's voice, though he was born centuries too late. His words wandered, lost in memory, until he said something that made her heart still. Some gods listen. This one eats. She asked what he meant. He only smiled and gestured toward the hills. The ones who go there never say their prayers out loud. They just carry them. Intrigued, Layla followed the path alone. It was not marked. She walked for hours beneath a sky the color of worn parchment, the sun pressing down not with heat, but with silence. She passed a lone tree, its bark blackened as if by old fire, and then a series of stones arranged in a crescent. Not a circle, not a tomb. A mouth. The air shifted. There, in the hollow beyond, she found it. Not a shrine. A depression in the earth, shaped like a bowl. Wide, shallow, lined with smooth stones etched not with words, but with lines. Short, jagged, angled toward the center, as if trying to escape or to enter. In the middle, a pit of black soil. Fresh, as if something had been eating from beneath. Layla knelt at its edge. She felt no fear, only weight, the kind that settles on the chest when a memory you buried long ago comes back. Without anger, without welcome, just presence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because she had felt it before. In the moments just before sleep, when your mind forms a prayer so fragile, so raw, you do not dare say it aloud. In the nights you sit by the window, gripping the edge of your breath, hoping someone, anything, is listening. In the ache that follows the words, please, even when no one answers. This is the God of that space. Not the God who intervenes. The God who holds, who absorbs, who consumes what we cannot. It does not offer miracles. It offers relief. It takes what we are too ashamed to carry. Layla closed her eyes, and the thoughts came, not in sentences, in sensations. A childhood wound she had never told anyone. The image of her mother's hands, trembling with goodbye. The time she almost left everything behind and didn't know why. The question she never dared ask herself. What am I for? She did not speak them. She only felt them rise and fall into the soil, and the earth shifted. A small indentation, a pull, as if the dirt had drawn something in and buried it with love. She opened her eyes and breathed. For the first time in years, her breath felt light. Empty not with loss, but with the grace of having been heard by something that did not require sound. She reached for her journal, but stopped. Words would only dull it. So she pressed her palm into the earth. Let it taste her pulse. Let it take what still lingered. And in that moment, she understood. This was not a God of devotion, nor of fear. It was the final sanctuary, the last hand that receives the thoughts you do not have the strength to speak, the things too tender for language, the longings that shame made too heavy to name. And it asks nothing in return, only this, that when you are ready to be emptied, you come with your hands open, your mouth closed, and your heart unlocked. Later, in her journal, Layla dared to write just one line. There is a God who does not give, who does not answer, And still, it saves us because it lets us let go. So tonight, if there is something inside you too raw for words, something aching, coiled tight, unspeakable, go outside, find a patch of soil, place your hand upon it, and do not say it. Feel it. The one who ate prayers is still there, and it is always hungry for what you no longer need to hold. Some journeys are not taken to arrive. They are taken to remember what the feet once knew, what the sky once whispered, and what the gods never stopped waiting for. The scrolls were fragmented. Layla had found them wrapped in beeswax cloth, sealed in a ceramic vessel buried beneath a collapsed threshold. Likely the entryway to a home, not a temple. There was no grandeur in their preservation, only care, like someone had hidden them not from conquest, but from forgetting. They told no myth. They offered no doctrine, only a list. Places, etched in the same hand, perhaps over many years. Some names are familiar, now ruins. Others were unknown, lost to erosion and time. But next to each one, a mark, a symbol, always the same. A footprint. And beneath it all, one final word. Gorelmek. It meant to be seen. Layla understood. This wasn't a list of destinations. It was a path, a sacred trail, a memory map for those who once walked, not to find, but to show themselves to the world. The last pilgrimage. She traced the route by satellite and instinct. It wound through mountain ridges and abandoned villages, forgotten cisterns and silent groves. It ignored modern roads. It followed the breath of the old land, through shadows, water, silence. And so she followed it, not as a researcher, as one more pilgrim. There were no companions. There were no signs, only the rhythm of her steps, the sky above, and the feeling that she was being watched, not by danger, but by witness. The first sight was a ridge of carved stones, not inscriptions, indentations, each the size of a palm, not decorative, not random, arranged in a long spiral across a plateau of limestone. She stood at its center as the sun rose and realized it wasn't for the gods to see the people. It was for the people to be seen by the land. She bowed her head and moved on. The next was a spring hidden beneath roots. The water ran cold, even in the heat of the day. No village nearby, no use for agriculture. But on the walls of the cave, soot marks, dozens, like fingerprints dipped in ash. She sat beside the water and let her hands become still. She thought not of gods, but of all those who had knelt here before her, not to drink, but to remember their thirst. And so it continued. She walked for days, then weeks. Each stop was a place not of glory, but of quiet reckoning. A grove where trees grew in a circle with nothing at their center. A cave where sound did not echo. A ledge carved into a cliff where offerings of broken bread and tears still remained, hardened by sun and salt. Everywhere, the same rhythm, the same presence, the same word unspoken. I was here, because that is what the pilgrimage was about. Not reaching the gods, but reminding them that someone still walked, that someone still carried the dust of ancient breath in their lungs. At the edge of the final site, a plateau known only by its coordinates, Layla stopped. It was barren. No stones, no carvings, only a patch of wild grass and the wind, moving low across the skin like a voice that didn't need to speak. And still she wept, because she felt it. This was the end, not of the journey, but of the remembering. Here, she knelt, not because it was sacred, but because it had been. And in kneeling, she made it sacred again. She pressed her forehead to the earth and whispered the only truth that mattered. I saw you. She left no offering, no trace, because the gods of this path never asked for devotion, only presence, only one more heartbeat to echo across the stones. She returned weeks later. Changed, not in appearance, but in gravity. She no longer carried questions, only silence. And in her journal, one final entry beneath the list of sights. The last pilgrimage is not a search for the divine. It is the divine searching through us. One step at a time, each footprint a prayer, each breath an altar. And when we reach the end, we do not find the gods. We find that they had never stopped walking with us. So if your feet ache without reason, if the road calls without a destination, if the air around you feels watched by something kind, begin walking. Say nothing. Bring nothing. Let the dust mark you. You are already on the pilgrimage. And the gods? They've been waiting for you to remember your way home. Not all gods were born. Some were built, breath by breath, tear by tear, in the long corridors of memory. Layla had begun to notice a pattern. It wasn't in the stones, nor in the stars, nor in the soil that clung to her boots like ancient language. It was in the stories. Each tale she had gathered, each whisper, each broken fragment, had something in common. A feeling, not fear, not devotion, but recognition. Even when the name was lost, the feeling remained. Even when the rituals crumbled, the breath before the ritual lingered. Even when the god was forgotten, someone still remembered how they made them feel. And what, she asked herself, is a god, if not the accumulation of 1,000 remembered moments that refused to die? She found the old man alone in a courtyard garden. He was nearly blind, and yet his hands moved across the herbs as if touching old friends. She asked him if he believed in gods. He chuckled. No, a pause, but I remember them. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Layla knew what he meant. There were no altars left, no statues, no prayers written on bark or clay. But he remembered how it felt to sit beside the old cypress tree and know something was there. Not watching, not judging, just present. And she began to see it everywhere. A woman touching her necklace before stepping into silence. A boy tracing a spiral into the dust with his toe. A herdsman singing the same 3 notes each morning to no one at all. These were not rituals. They were remembrances. And they kept something alive. Something that once had a name, and now only had shape. Not visible, but undeniable. One night, Layla wandered far into the hills. She carried no tools, no camera, only her journal and a single apple, soft, bruised, sweet. She stopped beneath a cliff overhang where the air smelled of iron and jasmine. The sky above was thick with stars, and the silence pulsed with a rhythm that made her heartbeat slow. And she spoke, not to the gods, to the memories. She told them everything she remembered, not from history, not from books, but from the deep part of her soul that still hummed with echoes. She spoke of the spiral stones, the sleeping priestess, the cave that breathed, the fire that hummed beneath her ribs, the names that had never been hers, but had passed through her like inherited dreams. And the air listened, and the ground warmed, and the silence wrapped around her like a shawl woven of all the people who had once done the same. And she knew this was the god, not a figure, not a force, a being made entirely of memory, of remembered scents, of repeated gestures, of songs half sung, of dreams that return even when their stories do not. It was not worshipped, it was woven. Every time a mother hummed the same melody to her daughter. Every time a mourner left a stone on a grave. Every time someone looked at the sky and whispered nothing at all, the god stirred. Not to act, to exist. Because existence, Layla realized, was its own miracle. She lay back against the earth, her head resting in the hollow of stone. She bit into the apple. Sweet, faintly bitter, like time, and she smiled. Because even if she forgot the names, even if she lost her notes, Even if the wind one day swallowed everything she'd written, she had become part of the memory, a thread in the god. And that was enough. She wrote, "This god does not wait to be called. It lives in the way we walk across familiar soil, in the way we turn our faces to the wind, hoping to smell something we once loved. It is the shape of hands repeating what no one taught them, the taste of fruit that only grows where prayers were once whispered. This god is not dead. It is remembered, and in that remembering, it lives. So tonight, if something stirs in your chest when you hear a song with no words, or you feel warmth in your spine for no reason at all, you are not haunted. You are holding something ancient. You are part of a god who no longer needs a name, only a place in your memory." Some gods never rose above the earth. They curled downward into soil and shadow, and speak now only in the language of leaves and roots. It began with a tree, not old, not towering, not sacred by any appearance. Just a crooked walnut standing alone on a hill, its trunk twisted like a question mark, its bark scarred by time and lightning. Layla had passed it many times before, never thinking much of it. But this time, she felt it. Not awe, vibration, low, steady, pulsing beneath the soles of her feet as she stood beneath its branches. A rhythm not unlike breath, slow and ancient but not human. The wind was still, the birds were silent, and the ground whispered, not with sound, but with presence. She knelt, placed her hand on the soil at the base of the tree, and closed her eyes. And then she heard it, not a voice, not a word, but a memory not hers. A woman, long ago, wrapping a newborn in moss. A man laying his tears beneath a stone at dusk. Children tying threads of wool around saplings, laughing without knowing why. None of them praying, all of them listening. Layla stayed like that for hours, her fingers sunk into the damp soil, until her pulse began to slow and match something deeper. She felt her breath shift, not in her lungs, but in her bones. And when she stood, her fingertips were black with earth. But it wasn't dirt. It was language, not one spoken or written. One felt over time, carried in roots, fed by rot, shared between trees like rumors past in shadow. She began to study the old groves, not the ones marked as sacred, the forgotten ones. Clumps of trees that had grown in spirals or along invisible lines that matched the constellation charts from 10,000 years ago. She walked barefoot among them for days. Each grove had a different rhythm, some slow and warm, some fast and brittle. One, near the ruins of an ancient granary, had no rhythm at all, only a dense silence, like a story never told. In one grove, she met a child. Silent, dirty, maybe 5 or 6 years old. He didn't speak, only pointed to a tree whose roots had surfaced, tangled like veins in the open. Then he sat beside it and placed his ear against the bark. So Layla did the same, and the world stopped. Not because time froze, because something older than time began to speak. The whisper wasn't sound, it was a knowing. She saw visions, not in color or form, but in sensation. The first fire lit beside this grove. The first song hummed by a woman before language had shape. The first hand to dig into this soil, not to bury, but to return. She understood then. This was not a place of worship. It was a nervous system, an organic memory web beneath the earth. Roots touching roots, sharing information, holding emotion, remembering grief, joy, birth, blood. The grove was a god, not singular, not embodied. A collective soul formed of everything that had ever grown and died here. And its voice, whispered in root language, passed through fungal threads and mineral size, stored in wood, released in wind. She remained in that grove until dusk. And as she left, the child was gone. Or perhaps he had never been there. Later, In her journal, Layla wrote, "Some gods speak not through thunder, but through sap, through the bend of a branch, the way bark splits in summer. They are not watched in temples. They are held in the palms of those who tend the soil, and say nothing." She began planting trees in every site she visited. A single seed, a breath into the soil. No marker, just a return. And with time, she stopped needing words, because she could feel the groves listening again, as if the old root networks had sensed her, recognized her, welcomed her back. So tonight, if you find yourself walking through trees, and you feel the hair on your arms rise for no reason, and the ground beneath you hums just faintly, stop. Place your hand on the bark. Place your ear to the trunk. Close your eyes, and do not expect words, only remembering, for beneath your feet, there is a whisper that was never meant to be loud, only true, and the gods who died forgotten, they are still speaking, in the slow, green breath, beneath the roots. Long before the first flame, before the wheel, before even the stone that dreamt of being carved, there was wind, and it was not just air, it was memory moving. Layla had reached the edge of the known world, not geographically, spiritualment. There were no more ruins, no more villagers, no more stories waiting to be found, only a stretch of high, barren land where even moss feared to grow. And beyond it, the sky, not above, before her, a wall of endless breath, soft, invisible, but pulsing with an old rhythm, not weather, origin. For days, she had followed no map, only the wind. It had grown stranger, more intentional. It didn't gust or howl. It didn't push. It called. Each morning, it rose before the sun. Not cold, not warm, just present. And she followed, until there was nothing left to follow but the silence between gusts. At the top of the final ridge, she stopped. There was no sign, no stone, no mark. Just a flat expanse of chalky ground and an endless, sky-colored silence. But the wind lingered here like it did in memory. She knelt, not in worship, in surrender. And then she remembered, not from story, from her bones. There had once been a belief, a truth whispered by those long vanished, that the wind was not a force, but a being. The first one, not shaped by time or made by gods. A god itself, born not of matter, but of longing. The first breath, given before there were lungs to receive it. They called it, in fragments of broken dialect, Emma, not a name, a sound, a breath drawn in and never quite released. The myth said Ama did not create life. Ama was life, and to speak was to disturb it. To exhale was to participate in it. The cult of Anatolia had no temples to Ama, because the entire sky was the temple, and every silence, a prayer. Layla stood and opened her arms, and for the first time in her journey, she did not listen. She let herself be listened to. The wind coiled around her, touched her cheeks, entered her mouth, moved down her spine like the slow remembering of a lullaby. And she knew this was not the end of a path. It was the beginning of all things. Because before gods had names, before offerings were shaped, before grief and hope had their colors, there had been this, a world made entirely of breath, moving, turning, waiting to become voice. And when the first human rose from the soil and exhaled, Ama listened, not as a god watching its creation, but as a mother hearing her child repeat her first sound back to her. And even now, after millennia of forgetting, of silence broken by noise, of temples buried and names lost, the wind still carried that sound, still waited for someone to say it again. Not with language, with presence. Layla let the air pass through her. She did not try to hold it or trap it. She became it. She opened her mouth and said nothing, but the wind understood. And that was enough. She wrote no final words in her journal. She closed it, buried it beneath the chalk dust of the ridge, pressed a single breath into the soil, and walked away, not toward home, toward everything. Tonight, as you lie in your bed with the world quiet around you, listen for that wind, not the one that rustles the leaves, the one beneath it, the one you heard the moment you were born, and forgot the moment you were named. That wind is still here, still breathing, still waiting, and it remembers you, even if you've forgotten. The gods,